Hello and welcome to another episode of Katie the Science Lady. I'm Mrs. Jacobson, and today's topic are homologous structures and other pieces of evidence for evolution. It's kind of a mouthful, so let's learn together. All right, so we are talking about different pieces of evidence for evolution. We've already talked about the fossil record, and we've talked about biogeography, and how those two things together can help show us where ancient organisms lived and how they moved over time, and also where they may have originated from. The first thing we need to look at are homologous structures, and you can see I have this little note here that says homo, H-O-M-O, means same, and that's what it means. So that prefix there, homo, means same. So homologous structures are in some way going to be the same. And it's what they are. It means that homologous structures, if there are organisms that shared them, they had a common ancestor that also had that structure. Those structures may have adapted to perform different functions over time. So we had one common ancestor with the structure. Organisms that have them probably adapted to perform different functions over time. So we're looking at the same structure, but different functions. Let me go ahead and illustrate that for us. In the forelimb or the arm of these different organisms, we see the same bones. We have a bat, a whale, a cat, and a human. They all have a humerus, radius, ulna, carpals, metacarpals, and phalanges. So remember, phalanges are your fingertips. So they're all going to have all these bones. They may look slightly different, but all the bones are there, and the structure is the same. It's kind of weird to think that a bat has a humerus, that upper arm bone, just like we do. They have a radius and an ulna, those kind of middle arm bones. And then they have all the bones of the hand like we do as well, but they're found in their wing. So these are the same structure, but different functions. We use our arm to grab things. Cats use their limbs, they use them to walk, but they also use them to dig. That's another function that they use them for. Whales use them to swim, and bats use them to fly. So that's what we look at and what we see when we say homologous structures. So same structure, different function. That's homologous structures. Now on the flip side, we also have analogous structures. And analogous structures are, kind of the same, but also different. Kind of weird. They're structures that may serve the same purpose, so they may have the same function, but they might not be related evolutionarily. So this is kind of a non-example. This is not evidence for evolution, but it's something we need to talk about regardless. So homologous structures, again, same structure, different function. This has similar structure. They're pretty much the same. So same structure, different function. Again, lizard would dig, a bird would fly, a human would grasp, and a whale would swim. But analogous structures, those are going to be a different structure, but the same function. All four of these limbs are used to swim. A whale, a turtle, a penguin, and a fish all use their limbs to swim. A turtle might also use them to kind of paddle on land, but for the most part, they're for swimming. Now, as we can see, the bones in here, completely different from each other. They're not the same organization. They're not the same structure, which means that they're not necessarily related evolutionarily. Another example that I like to use for analogous structures would be like a butterfly wing and a bat wing. A butterfly wing does not have bones. A bat wing does. They are completely different structures, but they both help the organism to fly. They both help that animal to fly. So they're not related, but they do have the same function. So we have to be really careful when we talk about evolution that just because something does the same thing, it doesn't mean they're related. So that's kind of important to note. Vestigial structures are personally my favorite evidence for evolution because it just makes sense to me. Vestigial structures are things that are present in a current organism but have absolutely no function. There is no reason for it to be there. It doesn't do anything. It doesn't make any sense. I love them. They make me happy. I don't know why. We can trace them back to structures that once were functional in their ancestors. So at some point back in time, they did have a function. But now I refer to them as useless because you can't use them anymore. So these are my favorite ones. For example, our appendixes, we have them at the end of our large intestine here, at the kind of juncture of our small and large intestine. We have an appendix. And at one point, we used that when we had back in time, mostly plant-based diets, because it would help us kind of digest some of these things, and sometimes contain bacteria to help us digest things. Nowadays, we don't need it. We cook our food. We have different structures, different food that we eat. So there's no reason for our appendix anymore. And the appendix at one point could have been a larger organ with different functions, but now it just sits there and gets infected. That's it. It's really useless. People take it out because it gets infected, and you just don't need it. It doesn't do anything for your body. So it's vestigial. My favorite example is the hip bone of a whale. If you look at this picture, those are bones that aren't connected to anything. They don't do anything. They can't do anything. They're not connected to any muscles or anything. So it's kind of funny that a whale just has bones hanging out in its tail. They are old hip bones because at one point, the ancestor of a whale walked on land. And we talked about that in our fossil record video. I'll try to post it somewhere here so you can kind of make note of that. But it's vestigial. There's no point in a whale having hip bones because it doesn't have hips or legs anymore. But it used to have legs, which is kind of the fun point. So vestigial structures, for me, they give me a really clear picture as to what they could have been used for at some point. And it shows that at one point there was a purpose for it, and now there's not. But there's no reason for them to be lost completely because they're not hurting the organism. Another evidence for evolution that we have are embryological similarities. The first part of this is embryo, which means a developing organism. So we're going to be looking at organisms and how they have similar stages in their development. And I'll show pictures as well. More distantly related species take different developmental paths. So the more distantly related things are, so the more further apart things are, they look pretty different as they're developing. If things are closely related, let's say all group of mammals, let's say a cat, a human, a sheep, and a pig. Let's say those 4 things. They're pretty closely related because we're mammals. We have the same, a lot of the same body structures. We have the same internal organs for the most part, and we all birth live young. So all of those things mean that we're going to be very similar as we're developing. So our embryos would look similar. If I gave you this and said, is that a sheep, a pig, or a human? You'd say, I don't know. It looks like all of them, if you had any evidence of what they looked like. But I'll tell you at this stage, you can't really tell what it is. It's a human, but you really can't tell the difference. If we look at this picture here, we have our human, our bird, our reptile. They look kind of shockingly similar. They all have these things called gill slits, which in a human are vestigial. Our embryos don't even use them anymore. So they're another vestigial structure that we have. But all these structures look very similar. Now, our reptile has a curlier tail. Our fish has a straighter kind of tail. But our bird and our human look very close. They could be brothers, basically. So it's interesting to see how the more closely related we are to each other, the more similar we look as we're developing. And then the differences come the more we develop. So the older that embryo gets, or the further along in its development, the more different that they will start to look. Let's take a look at it here. If you go from this blue all the way over to this red over here, and I asked you which one is the human, you'd say, what? I can't tell. They all look the same, basically, and they do. These are all different organisms. One is a human, and the rest are not humans. But it's kind of crazy how you really can't tell at the beginning. The most common answer I get from my students is they usually think that either this 4th one is the human, or this 5th one sometimes is the human. So usually these are my most 2 common guesses. Normally they don't think these blue are the human here. Sometimes I get the green, but usually we like to stick in this range. I make my students guess in class. As we develop, they can quickly say, okay, well, these 2 are for sure not a human. Those look kind of fishy. And over here, we're looking a little reptile-y. But between these last 4, they look very similar, and it's very difficult to tell which the human will be. And this means that these 4 are going to be most closely related. We can tell that these are a fish, and we're not as closely related to a fish, so we know that we're not going to look similar to this. Now, as they develop, we can tell that this will become a turtle, a chicken, a pig, a rabbit, and a human. A lot of times, my students think that this 4th one here, or 5th one, I don't know what number it is, but the orange one, they think that is the human. And in fact, that is the rabbit. So it's kind of interesting to see that we're very closely related to these because they're mammals, our pig and our rabbit mammals, and we look very, very similar in development. So similar you honestly can't tell them that far apart. The last piece of evidence that we're going to look at are biochemical similarities, aka DNA. This is a big one. This is the one that makes the most sense to most of us because we say, well, how close is our DNA? How closely related are we? We know that all humans are over 99% similar to each other. It's usually 99.9% similar. So the amount of commonalities or the amount of base pairs we have in common can help us determine how closely related we are to another organism. The more differences we have, so the further apart we are, so let's say if I only have 20% of my DNA in common with something, the longer it's been since we had an ancestor. If I have 98% of my DNA in common, we have more in common. We haven't had that much time between our common ancestor. So if we look at our chart here, we have 95% of our DNA in common with a rhesus monkey, if we're looking at hemoglobin. So again, this is a specific protein that we're looking at. It's for our blood. And we have 95% of that particular protein's DNA in common with a monkey. This should make sense. We are more closely related to a monkey than we are to a lamprey, a frog, a chicken, or a mouse. In this way, we can determine how closely related members of different species are. It can help us categorize them, and it can also give us indications of how they may have evolved over time based on the amount of amino acids or the amount of DNA that they have in common.
All right, let's recap. So remember, we're talking about evolution as a concept. And what that means is we're talking about change over time being millions of years, and change being in a population or group of organisms, not in a particular individual. It's always really important to remember this because it sometimes gets lost as we're thinking about these kind of nebulous concepts. So change in a population over a long period of time is evolution. The first thing we talked about today was homologous structures, and these are going to be the same structure found in different organisms that have different functions. So the bones are formed essentially the same way, but they may have very different functions. For example, a cat leg, a human arm, a whale flipper, all have the same bone structure, which sounds crazy, but they're going to have different functions. One's used to swim, one's used to dig, and we obviously use our arms to grip things because that's what our hands are made for. Analogous structures are the exact opposite. They are different structures but have the same function. One of the best ways for me to remember this is thinking about wings. Butterfly wings and bat wings are not structurally the same at all. You could say one has bones and one doesn't, but they have the exact same function. They are used to fly. So they're not necessarily going to be used to show evolutionary relationships. So it's really important to remember that they don't necessarily equate with evolutionary relationships. Next, my favorites, vestigial structures. They are things that were once useful but now have no purpose. I like to call them useless junk. In our bodies, we have several. One of the most important ones that we can think of is the appendix, which we only really notice when it gets infected and we have to get it taken out at the hospital. But nowadays, we don't use it for anything and it just kind of sits in our body unused. Additionally, another example would be the hip bone of a whale. Why do whales have hip bones, you might say? They don't have feet. They probably did millions of years ago. And you can see using our fossil record and a couple of different pieces of evidence that we see that to be the case. But now a modern whale has no use for a back hip bone because it has a flipper or a tail. Finally, this may make the most sense to most of us. The more closely related organisms are to each other, the more DNA they have in common. Additionally, they're going to look more similar as they develop embryologically. So telling the difference between a chicken, a turtle, a human, a pig, and a sheep while they're developing can be really difficult at certain times because they're going to act in similar ways, they're going to have similar structures in the body, and they're fairly similar genetically. Thank you for joining me today. I hope you had a bit of fun. I hope you learned something interesting. It's always a lot of information when we talk about evidences for evolution because there's lots of little different things to pick up on. So please like, comment, and subscribe to my channel for more content as well as how-to videos and step-throughs. And as always, I hope you had fun. I hope you learned something, and I'll see you later.